guys, so today I will be teaching you how to play chess. I will be showing you how each piece moves, and I will be showing you what the basic rules of chess are. So since you can't really win many games with just knowing how the pieces can move, the next video will be about the beginner tactics. So I will start by explaining how the board is set up. A chessboard is an 8x8 grid, which has both light and dark squares, 32 light squares and 32 dark squares. They are set in a checkerboard pattern such that no light square is touching each other by sides and no dark square is touching by sides. It is made up of rows and columns, rows being called ranks. So that row that I just highlighted would be called the first rank, second rank, third rank, and so on. Columns are called files. So this column would be called the A file, the B file, and so on. The pawn is probably the most basic piece in chess. On its starting square, which for white, all pawns will start on the second rank, and for black, all pawns will start on the seventh rank. The pawn can move 2 squares forward, and only forward. It cannot move side to side, backwards, diagonal, or any other way. But if it has left its starting square, then it can only move 1 square forward. So when two pawns collide, I guess, they can't really do anything. They can only take diagonally. So white can take this way, and black, that pawn can take that way. So they are kind of just stuck until other pawns or other pieces are involved. This is a pawn taking a pawn, which they can only do diagonal, either right or left. When a pawn or a piece takes another one, it is called a capture. Another rule is what happens when a pawn were to get to the enemy last rank, which for black, their last rank is 8, and for white, the last rank is 1. I will talk about this later because it is the most complicated rule of pawns. The next piece is the bishop. Bishops can only move on diagonal, so a light squared bishop could take this pawn, and this pawn, and a dark squared bishop could take this pawn, this pawn, this pawn, and that pawn. But dark squared bishops and light squares bishops can never get onto the same squares. This is what the light squares and dark squares are for. So the bishops can never leave. The light squared bishop can never leave the light squares. The dark squared bishops can never leave the dark squares. So bishops are very useful on these long diagonals. I'll talk about this more later. So this piece is called the knight, and it can move in a very interesting way. It can move 1 square in any direction, and then 2 in another direction. And it can also jump over pieces, enemy or your own pieces, so this is very crucial. So it can go like this, and then take this pawn. It skips right over this pawn. Then it can go like this, and take this pawn. It doesn't matter which way you do the 2 and then the 1. But it has to be in that, like, L shape. I guess this is an upside down L. This is an L2. So it can only take that way. It can move forward or backwards. And yeah. So here is how a knight can move. It can go to this square, this square, this square, or any of these squares if it is in the center. Knights are better in the center because they can control more space. But if you have a knight on the edge, then it can only control 4 squares instead of 8. so it is much more beneficial than to start to try to get your knights to the center. This next piece is called the rook. It can move vertically or horizontally along either a file or a rank. So it could go in this pattern. It can move forward or backwards like any other piece. Rooks are used in a special move called castling, which I will talk about later. Queens are easily the most powerful piece. They can move on any diagonal, or they can move straight. So this queen can go and take the bishop, this knight, this pawn, and the rook. Obviously, you take turns in chess, so it couldn't happen all at once, but I'm showing. The queen can move this way, that way, this way. And it isn't limited just to the light squares. If it were to move here, it can also be on the dark squares. Oops. Get what I mean? So the king can move in any direction, one square. Can move forward or backwards, and it is the most important piece. I will explain this later, as I said for a lot of things, but anyway, so it can go in this manner, but it takes a long time to move the king since it can only move one square per turn. So now I will show what happens when a pawn reaches the enemy last rank. So this is called promotion. If a pawn reaches the last rank, you can choose what piece it can become. You can choose a bishop, a knight, a rook, or a queen. You cannot make a king because it's just illegal. But usually, I would say maybe 95% of the time, 99% of the time, you want to make a queen, since they are the most powerful piece. Because if you making a bishop is pointless, because a queen is a bishop plus a rook. The queen can move along the diagonals and vertical and horizontal, but rooks can only move vertical or horizontal, and bishops can only go along diagonals. So occasionally you want to make a knight, which is very, very, very rare for you to want to make a knight. It's only if it's like checkmate, which I will explain what checkmate is later, or if it'll just win material in some way. But yeah, so getting pawns to the enemy last rank is very beneficial, because you can make another queen or a new queen if you traded yours off earlier in the game. So here is a normal chess setup where I'll talk about a few things. Each piece has its own value. Queens are worth 9 or 8 points depending on who you're talking to, or where you look up your information. Knights and bishops are both worth 3 points, and rooks are worth 5. Pawns are also just worth 1 point, and kings don't have a value because they're the most important piece. And so I will show you an example of a game to demonstrate what castling is. So this is also going to be, I'm going to teach you chess notation, which this is called e4. You don't, for other pieces you would say like knight to whatever, or bishop to here, queen to here. But for pawns you just say the rank and the file. So this pawn is in the e file, and it's on the 4th rank. So it'd be pawn to e4, or just e4. And then black would respond most of the time with e5. So it's on the e file, and it's on the 5th rank. then white usually would respond with knight to f3. It's on the f file and on the third rank, and the point of this is to attack this pawn. So black usually responds with knight to c6. It's on the c file and on the 6th rank. So the game could continue with bishop to c4, and then bishop to c5, and then white can play the move called castling. If a king and a rook have not moved at all during the game, then they can castle. This is when the king moves 2 squares, and then the rook goes on the other side of it. So I can replay that. So the rook will go here, because the king will be on this square. And I will demonstrate this because you can do this on the queen side too. This is called king side castling. And so yeah, the queen side is this side because it starts with the queens, and this side is called the king side because the kings start on that side. So now I will demonstrate what queen side castling be with like the start of a game. e4, e5, knight to c3. Instead of knight to f6, you can also just defend your pawn instead of attacking your opponents, because this knight will guard that pawn. And then they could respond with knight to f6, adding more pressure to this pawn. And then you could spawn with like d3, further protecting this pawn. And then knight to c6, bishop to d5. This is a tactic called a pin. I will explain what a pin is in the next video. Could play pawn to, or just d6, queen to f3. I know this isn't the most accurate moves, but I'm just explaining castling. Bishop to e6, trying to pressure maybe that pawn. And then this is something called queenside castling. So this time the king still moves 2 squares, and then the rook will go on the other side of it, even though the rook does move a little bit farther this time. So yeah, you can castle on either side. Maybe you have to move this rook if you want a queenside castle. Maybe it's just better to queenside castle. Or maybe you don't have any of your pieces on the king side developed. Like in this case, all the queenside pieces are developed. Developing a piece is when you move it really out of its starting position. So now I will demonstrate one more special pawn move, it's the most recent added chess rule, which was 1600. So this is probably one of the quickest ways you could get to this move. It is called en passant, which is French for in passing. So you could start with e4, knight to f6, e5, d5, knight to f3, f5. So this special move happens when your pawn, if you're white, is on this 5th rank, and black pushes his pawn twice such that it is next to your pawn. So this is it's pretty rare. It doesn't really happen very much in game. I just demonstrated how it would happen the fastest. So what happens is it's e takes f6. So you diagonally take this way. It's to prevent blocking, so black doesn't continue with moving the pawn forward and just encasing your pawn. So, because if you block all your opponent's pawns, then it could end in a draw really easily, because you could just push all your pawns, such that no piece can get through without you sacrificing. Let's just say it prevents black or white, whatever you're playing as, from being exceptionally annoying. So yeah, that's en passant, which would be you could take this way if black gets a pawn over here, which it's not letting me do for now because white's move. You go there, and then black could do the same thing if his pawn was there. Every sunrise is just for you. So now I will explain what check and checkmate are. So a game could start with, instead of the king's pawn, you could move any pawn or the knights out. It's really your choice. Or you don't even have to push them 2 squares. You can literally just move them 1 to start. But let's start with this game with d4, d5, knight to c3, knight to f6, e3, supporting this pawn. Pawns are especially strong when they're in chains. Since pawns are only worth 1 point, any other piece taking it, and then, like, if we were to bring out this knight and then take this pawn, it's not worth it, because then that's losing 2 points of material. You get a knight worth 3 points for a pawn worth 1 point. So the stronger your pawns are, the better. Anyway, bishop to f5, knight to f3, e6, bishop to b5, check. Check is where the black has to do something about their king. Their king is under attack. The king is the most important piece, so something must be done about that. There are 3 ways to stop a check. You can either take the piece, which in this case there's nothing that can capture this piece, so black can move the king, or black can block with the pawn, which is probably the best move in this scenario, or block with the knight, with this knight, or with the queen. The queen is definitely not the best move, because the queen is worth 9 or 8 points, however you think, and a bishop is only worth 3, so that would not be worth it to block with the queen. Since a pawn is only worth 1 point, and the pawn is now attacking the bishop has to move out of the way, or it can move out of the way this way, attacking this bishop, or even further back, whatever you want. But yeah, so then that strengthens the pawns. So yeah, you probably want to block with the pawn in this scenario. So yeah, the 3 ways to stop a check are to move the king, block, or capture the piece. So I will now explain what checkmate is. So checkmate would be where black's king can no longer move. An example would be something such as e4, e5, queen to h5, knight to c6, bishop to c4, knight to f6, queen takes f7, checkmate. The king cannot take the queen because it is guarded by the bishop, and it cannot move anywhere else. And no piece can take this queen besides the king. Nothing else is attacking it. So the king cannot move, and that would be checkmate. So come along and So there are another 2 ways to end a chess game that doesn't end in checkmate. This position is called a stalemate. If it is black's move, black has no legal moves. The queen is guarding these squares, so the king's only square is there, but it's guarded by the king. So black cannot go anywhere without losing his king, it's illegal to move into check, basically. So therefore, this is called a stalemate, where black has no legal moves, and it is a draw. Which a draw means, yeah, just no one wins. So there is another way to draw a game. So this is where you have a position, let's say white takes this pawn, and then black takes this pawn. Now there are no pieces besides the king. The kings can do whatever they want, but there is no way to checkmate. This is the same even if white has a bishop, it's still a draw, because there is no way to checkmate with a bishop. Same for a knight. You can put him in check a billion times, but the king will always be able to escape against a knight. Against a rook, though, there is a way to checkmate. As you can't see on the sidebar, but eventually this will end in checkmate. I could maybe show that if it is white's move. Oops. So you go like maybe here, he goes back, and eventually the king will just move back, and you can force it into this position where it is checkmate. Or you can mate with a queen, where if you get a queen and a king like in this position, or even like here, or anywhere where the queen is guarding the king is guarding the queen and the queen attacks their king. King cannot take the queen because it's guarded by the king and he can't move any other spots because the queen will just take him or the king. So I think that is really all for the basic rules of chess. Please like and subscribe, and I will put out the next video soon about the basic tactics such as pins, forks, and probably other basic tactics.